Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 68 of the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And tonight, Aaron and I are going to try something a little bit different. Actually, we're recording two podcasts at the same time. And I know that just sort of blew your mind, but Aaron's off doing another show talking about a bunch of aspects of Amazon Web Services and the reInvent conference and some of the stuff he did last week. I am on with a couple of old friends and good friends of the show, Gina Minks and Ed Saipetch from Inktank. Guys, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you.
So we had a lot of folks who have been asking us to do more and more things with open source and talk to folks in the community and talk to folks that were doing cool things. So I thought I will get you guys on. You both recently, Ed, you've been on the show a couple of times. The last time we talked, you were doing some interesting things with Joyent. You've since left. Gina, you were doing some stuff with Dell. Have since left. What are you guys doing at Inktank nowadays?
I'll go first, I guess. I'm the director of training and certification. So I'm right now I'm deep in the development process for our training courses for Ceph.
Cool.
And I'm the director of alliances and channels. And so a little bit of a different role from what people might have known me for before, which is purely technical. Now I manage the relationships with our large alliance partners like Intel, Calxeda, Dell, a handful of them, and then also the channel side, which is the VARs and SIs who are doing stuff with Inktank and end users.
Okay, very, very cool. And for anybody who doesn't know Ed or isn't familiar with him, Ed runs one of the very, very cool podcasts, Speaking in Tech. So if you're not listening to that one, put it on your list. Ed does it with Greg Neerman and Sarah Vella, and Gina comes on sometimes as a guest. So if you're not listening to those guys, give them a listen. So let's start with some really basic stuff. So for anybody who isn't familiar with Inktank, give us a little bit of background on who Inktank is, kind of where it came from, and then kind of the core product, the core technology you guys work on, which is called Ceph. What's up with Ceph, and why is it cool, and why are people interested in it?
Sure. So Ceph is a technology. It's an open source scale-out storage technology that's been around for a number of years. I'd say probably, I think it's like 7 or 8 years now. But it was an open source project started by our CEO and founder, Sage Weil. And Sage worked on it during his PhD program at UC Santa Cruz. And what was interesting about it is he saw a lot of challenges with scale-out storage and HPC around things like Lustre and stuff like that, around performance, metadata servers, those kinds of things. So he said, hey, we should be doing this stuff with object storage. We should kind of be solving these problems at a little bit lower level and doing it differently than what people are traditionally used to. So he worked on that for a while. He's one of the co-founders of DreamHost, which is a pretty large hosting company. And so with that, about a year ago, the idea came to say, okay, Ceph itself is starting to get mature. So, hey, there's a lot of customers who are trying this out. Some of them are looking for support, either development or end-user support when they go into production. And so that was really the genesis of Inktank, is really putting a company behind the open source project, very similar to what Red Hat did and a lot of other open source companies. So it's kind of, there's just the open source project, and we just do support and services and also co-development around it for customers and partners.
Okay, very cool. So I was telling somebody, I don't know, a few months ago when you left to go over there, I said, you're kind of, I think at the time you were originally doing sort of systems engineering stuff before you were, or sort of services systems engineering before you took on. And I said, you're kind of beginning to become kind of the next generation type of systems integrator or VAR, in that you're not dependent on some vendor. You're sort of, it's use your own smarts, drive the community. You kind of drive your own markets. You can kind of drive your own use cases. So Ceph is it's an Apache project, or it's just where is it living from a community perspective, from an open source perspective?
It's LGPL, and there's no foundation that's really on top of it. One thing that I should mention that's pretty cool is that Ceph, the client side, is upstreamed into the Linux kernel. So if you have a Linux kernel within the last 2 years and you set up a Ceph cluster, those guys can all mount it and consume Ceph storage, be it block or object or file system.
Okay, so that means that's sort of the interesting thing when you start getting into these open source projects is, unlike a traditional, say, hardware vendor, storage vendor that might say, hey, my channel is, the sort of the traditional types of channels, distributions, and so forth. I mean, your primary channel is almost like Linux distributions, right? It's Canonical, it's Red Hat, it's all the different ones that are out there. Is it certain Linux distros, or is it sort of all of them at this point?
So we have partnerships to varying degrees. I mean, you can say that they're consumable if somebody wants to bootstrap things themselves. There's Red Hat packages, there's Ubuntu packages, and also SUSE packages. Some of those partners we work a little bit closer with, like Canonical and SUSE, to make sure that on the server side of things, those packages are already sitting inside of those distros. It's a part of SUSE Cloud, which I think is preview. I don't remember if it was GA yet. Okay. And then Ubuntu has it upstreamed into their releases as well. And then you get also some pretty interesting things around the automated deployment systems that these vendors are building. So Canonical uses something called Juju, which is kind of like Ceph or Puppet. So it's really about being able to stand these things up pretty easily. So we do more extensive work with Canonical and SUSE for sure. Red Hat's kind of been out there, and Red Hat, those guys have had Gluster as an acquisition. So it's kind of been a little bit interesting trying to figure out how to work with Red Hat and how they want to work with us.
Right. So walk me through, and Gina, jump in here. So sort of walk me through kind of a typical engagement. So you find a business, you find some developers that have been playing with Ceph, say the open source bits. They engage Inktank because they know you guys know it. They want to take it to the next step. What's the typical sort of engagement? I mean, who do they typically engage Inktank first? Do they go through a partner like Dell or somebody else? And then what's the typical engagement? Is it Gina? Are you going on site to help them do training for stuff? Is it consulting kind of time? I mean, what's a typical sort of engagement around that?
I'll let Ed go ahead and start that, because that's basically all he does right now, right, Ed?
Yeah. So we've got. We do actually. I mean, it kind of feeds into exactly what Gina's been doing. But before Gina came along, customers who are still trying to figure out how to adopt it and how to use it will pay us to come in and do things around training. So technical deep dives with an engineer for a couple of days. Right now, Sage is in China doing something with a large alliance partner where he's spending a week there as they start to build some things around Ceph on the hardware side. So those are a handful of the engagements, and then we also have, the technology is kind of split up between block, object, and file. And right now, there are people deploying block and object in production, but there's still a tremendous amount of interest around file. What we find in those file system use cases is that a lot of people are going through and POCing it first to see if they can use it to replace things like Gluster and Luster. So you'll find engagements where you'll help somebody stand up a POC and then kind of support them. On the block and object side, we have customers who are already doing production support. The interesting thing I think about it is that people will ask us when they're prospects or they're investors or their alliance partners of, how many customers do you have? How many customers? And the answer that we have is, well, we have X amount of customers, but you have to realize when you're dealing with an open source project and an 8-month-old company, the project really is much larger than we are. And I think, even as Gina's kind of doing a lot of her training stuff, she can kind of speak to this. But, a handful of her information, though, a lot of it comes from Inktank, is out there. It's in the community. And so really kind of gluing those things together to do both the services side, support, and then also do things like training for people has kind of been it's kind of evenly split between those type of engagements.
Gotcha. I think the other thing I'd say too is it's an awful lot like Linux was when like 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. So and I was definitely somebody who used Linux and was going through the process of which flavor do we use, and all of that kind of thing. So I think it's an awful lot like that, since it's an open source product. There's a very active community. So if you look at the Ceph community, there's an IRC channel. People just kind of pop up and say, "Hey, I'm trying to figure this out." The engineers sit on the IRC channel, so you're getting this really direct feedback from people who are developing and contributing to that code base,
right,
and helping people out. And that is actually where there's a lot of meat for me as I'm developing the training, some of the questions that get asked and what do people need to know. But I think kind of where people are and how they do things, you can't, it's not like a project that's not open source, like a commercial product where you'd have to, put in a fake name to get a download and try it out if that's really what you wanted to do. Sure. You can actually just go and grab the code and try it out and come and ask somebody some questions and or poke around blog posts, and that's kind of how it gets started sometimes as well.
Right. And that, and I think we've heard that from a lot of people. I mean, I know, we've had Peter Ulander, who runs the Cloudstack project, or was heavily involved with that from an open source perspective, and he's kind of quick to say things like, well, we've got like 10s, 20s, 30,000 customers. Not all of them are paying. In fact, the majority of them don't pay them directly. But like you said, you do have this sort of very large number of people who take advantage of the fact that you can go experiment with it. You can go play with it. You can see where it fits, and you can kind of see how much you want to deal with it. And then you go explore the IRC channels. You go explore the communities. And so I'm curious. And part of this I'm kind of just exploring. The difference between sort of the traditional companies and the ones that have this hybrid between, open source products and kind of, for fee products. I mean, it's like what Red Hat has done, but obviously that model evolves. So even as you're doing, training and certification, I'm kind of poking at this because there is a lot of people that are trying to figure out, how do I engage with this? How do I update my skills? I mean, do you have to think about that from an open source perspective? Is the things you're building, the content you're building, are you thinking in terms of, I'm going to give a lot of this away to the community up front, or do you think about that as a product, more as an enterprise kind of product?
So that's definitely a discussion. It's an interesting internal discussion all the time as well. And I think, I started talking about this back at EMC, about this idea of a learning GPS. And even with commercial products, if you go and Google like Symmetrics or Clarion, you can get some blog posts that are better than most of the training that's written. And I can say that because I worked in the training department.
Sure.
So I think the way that we as technical people learn is very different. So the whole idea of the learning GPS is that, any time you go to a boot camp that is specifically tailored to your job role and things you need to know to get your job done, that's always the fastest way to learn something. But a lot of times what happens, like a 5-day course for most of us is useless, right? Once you get to a certain technical level, you come in with so many experiences and knowledge that, you might need like half a day's lecture, and you're like, oh yeah, that was worth the 5 days that it's basically like you're checking email the rest of the time. So there's a huge, development process of what is actually things people will need to know to get started, and how much of that already exists, and how, what is for that direct, that direct line in the GPS, that boot camp. That's probably what we want to charge people for, and have the advantage that, our company has the most committers to the project. For the training development, I have best access to them right now.
Gotcha.
And then how do we point them, like the next thing, the other thing a GPS will do is like avoid the highways. What if I just kind of want to, I've got other projects going on, I just want to pick this up when I can. So can we point people to the best RSS feeds, or to the best podcast, or, how do we point people to the best information, Twitter accounts to follow, whatever, so that if they just kind of want to pick it up little bit by little bit, that they can. So kind of thinking about that. And we have a VP of community and a great marketing team that are super social, that are all involved with that. So I think it's kind of like this combination. It has to be. I mean, we just don't, it's not just technology that's changing, but definitely education's changed, because we've got the technology to do things that actually make a lot more sense than they did 15 years ago.
Yeah, let's people do it when they want to, where they want to, all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
So you guys have both been with kind of traditional storage vendors in the past. Storage may or may not be considered sexy or interesting to some people, but it does have certain kind of technical characteristics that people come to expect, right? In terms of latencies and availability, and and I know, having sat through some of the webinars, for Build a Cloud Day and some things where Inktank and Ceph is present, it kind of builds on this idea of, it's software-defined storage. It can take advantage of, the latest Intel hardware and those things. But like, how are you finding people as they're deploying it, especially maybe not so much with Object, because Object has a lot more flexibility. The applications are built to sort of deal with failure. But, when you're seeing people do it for file or for block, like, who kind of puts the guidance around that says, this is how you should build the network for it. These are the kind of hardware nodes that you should typically use for certain kind of performance. How does that work in sort of the open source storage world? Or what are you seeing people doing? What are you seeing the community doing?
I tend to see a lot of people who are, you've got two camps. You've got the self-starters who they tend to either be in HPC, or they're really kind of up to date with what's happening in cloud, and that's kind of where you see a lot of the interest. And that's one camp of people where it's really kind of got grassroots adoption versus top-down adoption. And then you've also got those portion of people who might not be familiar with it, and they're like, we want to replace the incumbents that are sitting here, and there's an open source and better way to do it. And I think that's the same, like, that Gina was talking about with Unix, right? A lot of us who have been end users at some point in time were like, hey, instead of having all these Solaris web servers, let's use Linux on x86 hardware. So you've got those two types of adopters. The people who are the self-starters tend to experiment, and then sometimes things will go bad, sometimes things will go good. But I think all across like the board with those guys, you have to kind of try to make sure as much information is out there as possible around best practices and stuff like that, or that they know who to go to. But more typically, they're going to use community information. And then when you get things like top down, where it's it starts off as like a mandate for a project, there's funding behind it, those kinds of things. They'll engage us first. I mean, they'll definitely get involved and say, okay, like, how do we do this so we don't mess it up? It's not really a whole lot different than what we've been used to in the VDI days, right? Like, 2 years ago. I think it's getting a little bit better these days, but people would say, oh, I can deploy virtual desktops. I found space on our SAN. I did the 60-day trial, and the experience was horrible, right? Because storage actually is it can still be a pretty complicated thing to engineer, even with Ceph. Like, right. Even with as easy as we are to manage, grow clusters, do those things, you can still screw it up, right? You pick your hardware, you throw your software on there. I think that's what a lot of vendors who are doing software-only storage or software-only based solutions that are dependent upon hardware experience. So, the best thing that you can do is make sure that the community is armed with enough knowledge. There's wikis out there. There are those kinds of things. But, honestly, Brian, I mean, I don't really see it still tends to be a world out there where if you Google how to deploy Ceph, it's not like there's a wealth of knowledge at the moment. And that might be just because Ceph is not nearly as widely adopted as some, but right now I would say, as far as community-based information around best practices around Ceph, I think we're still figuring that out, and in turn that really looks very similar to what you would look for if you look for a blog post on how to, the best way to configure your VNX or your FAS or whatever.
Yeah, okay. And it's so, the open source storage space is kind of it's getting a little bit crowded. I mean, you talked about Gluster. Gluster got bought by Red Hat. You've got Nexenta. You've got some of the people spinning out some things with OpenStack with Swift and Cinder, and and then you even got some of the sort of hybrid database storage companies like a Basho or somebody like that. I mean, in the kind of traditional storage space, storage admins, for example, over time they've sort of learned, okay, that vendor does this fairly well. This vendor does that fairly well. What are you guys finding? Because I got to imagine a lot of the people you deal with maybe aren't traditional storage admins. They're developers. They're DevOps. I mean, what are you finding is sort of the sweet spot for Ceph, or where do you find people start to understand which one might make more sense for certain applications or other applications, or is it still a little bit hazy?
You want to take that, Gina?
I think it kind of depends, and this could. I always like. I think number one, since we do all the types of storage that a typical storage admin would be used to, that's an easy way for them to kind of break into it. It's an object store at its base. You can mount. There's ways to mount it as a block, and there's a file system. So it's kind of that same story, super scalable. So that part of it's, I think, an easy entryway to start talking about it to storage people. And I think developers, they care about storage in a different way than storage people do,
right?
For sure. And that's interesting. I think that Inktank has done a really good job hiring. The core developers are all from that kind of developer programming mentality, and they're using what they want to see in storage. That's kind of how the whole foundation of everything is. That's what drives what they're doing. They brought in a bunch of us from different storage, the enterprise side, to come and work. And so you now have this kind of blending of things. And I think because the developers see storage as something just like make it be there and make it so, and they're finding ways to make it so. They bring some really interesting, cool ideas to the table that those of us that are real storage people that are terrified of ever losing a byte of data,
right,
would never, ever want to try. And I think it's a good blend. And I think that's what has to happen. We have to get back to the days when, if you were in the data center doing anything, you were dev and ops. If you did anything operational, you also had to be able to do and understand the dev side. And if you were going to do the dev side, you had to understand and be able to do the ops side. So we had the switch when we went to client server where that all changed. Now it's kind of coming back. I think that's what's I'm probably not answering your question, but
no, it's good. That's what I guess my sort of follow up. I'm trying to, obviously as a kind of unified storage, you can, like you said, you can do object. You can be S3 compatible. You can do file. You can do block. And when you can kind of do all those things, I mean, at some level you could go, hey, we could sort of do anything. I mean, you could run the bulk of the application using object for scale out. It may still use some amount of file for logging, and it might use block to boot the machines. I mean, right? Just as simple as that. Do you find like one of the things Ed mentioned is, Ceph is sort of designed the things you guys have put in to make it very easy to manage, very easy to scale, add nodes, grow the cluster. Do you find people tend to start with one aspect of it, say object, and then kind of migrate and pick up the other ones as they need to? Or do they sort of come to you at the kitchen sink and say, we like the fact that you do all of them in one code base and we're going to use all of it? Or, do you find that, or...
I think the answer is both. So I think that people usually come to us with one use case in mind. But the reason why Ceph does definitely have an advantage over its competitors is because it does give you the kitchen sink. The one thing that you could always counter that with is, well, how can you do everything so well? And the answer to that is really, if you're doing it well at a low level, adding things on top of it, not bolting on technologies like just strapping things together and kind of disrupting your engineering mentality of assuming everything can fail, but really saying, okay, if we engineer it right at the lowest levels, can we do things at the higher levels? And I think that's what's made us successful to some degree, is that we do still sit on top of disks that have a file system on them, because that's a quick way to market. But then the way that we handle intelligence about how many copies to write, what to do if a node fails, what to do if a drive fails, it's handled at the object level. And so when you start to design those things in, people will come to you and say, okay, like, I love the way that this is architected. By the way, I love the way that, like, since it's engineered pretty well at the lower levels, then can I start to use other technologies that adapt onto that? And I think kind of the next phase that you'll see is and just making sure, optimizing those different use cases. So now we're spending a lot of effort on the file system and things around like Hadoop and big data, which is ironically where the project started. But since Inktank was formed, we spent a lot because we got a lot of traction in the OpenStack community. We're pretty involved with the CloudStack guys as well. But when customers are saying, "Hey, I have no equivalent of OpenStack for storage,"
yep.
it just made such an easy fit for us, and we were really involved with the OpenStack Foundation, or the board and the community and the developers. So it makes it easy for us to go there. But I think over time, we'll just continue to improve those use cases. And I think the other thing is that we kind of picked off work in chunks and phases. So we picked it by use case. We didn't necessarily say, let's just spend all this time working around just pure object.
Yeah.
At the lower levels, what we did is we tried to iterate and improve the things to the point where they were production stable, and then when you move beyond that, then you can start to add these features and functions. But Sage. I don't know. When I first got the pitch from Sage and Brian Bogensberger, who's our CEO and president, as soon as they start to mention, like, by the way, these objects are extensible, so you can add classes to these objects. And you start to think, oh wow, like, so that means that I can do things like build an application where the storage is now doing the compute around the storage inside of the node. That starts to make a lot of sense, and you're like, wow, this stuff was built in from the get-go. So that's been pretty interesting. The other thing that I'll add too is there seems to be, like, when we talked about when I was at Joyent, those guys had picked the Solaris horse. As odd as a horse as it was, Solaris had some inherent features, things like dtrace and, pretty, in terms of how it handled containers and OS virtualization. They were pretty interesting. That was kind of like it's almost, I liken it to a religious decision.
Yeah.
So Ceph, which uses Crush, it's pseudo-random placement, but it's, other companies are sitting out there developing products that pick, a ring as a method to replicate and protect nodes, and other ones are doing consistent hashing, and all of those have their drawbacks. I think Crush, you could probably say it may have, certain drawbacks here or there, but we've been able to scale the protocol to where how we place data, how we move data pretty well, to where you don't see these things like if you add capacity to a Lustre cluster, you may see a whole ton of your data move inside of the data center. With us, we just move a little bit of that data for the added capacity. So far, this story has worked out where, the things that you expect out of a storage system that can actually hold your data, protect your data, and make sure you don't lose your data have held true. And I don't know if Gina has anything to add to it, but she's been spending a ton of time with the engineers and developers building the training material, and I think that we still find that at its purest form, Ceph still feels like that next gen, not like you made a ton of compromises to get to where you are by picking a religion.
Right.
Well, the other thing is, we kind of have hinted around about it, but it's truly modular. So, like, if you want to use all of it, the kitchen sink, you can. If you only want to use one, that's the only one you use. So it's not like you install this big thing and you use everything. You're going to have the Ceph cluster, which is the object store. You'll have that no matter what. But if all you're doing is block, you can just only do block. Right. If all you want to do is use the file system, you can just use the file system. So I think that's pretty compelling too. And I think the way that the Crush algorithm works is just, it's really solid. So that's actually,
and that's always the trade-off with storage architectures is like Ed, like you said, I mean, you can kind of get religious about stuff, but at some point, you probably do certain things really, really well because it's at the deepest level, that's the core of how it's built. You might be great at file, you might be great at object, and then I think what you're ultimately kind of hoping for is once you add that other types of functionality on top of it, you don't make the code completely spaghetti, so that you can kind of be flexible. Like you said, like if you guys down the road, want to do native Hadoop file system, and you want to run compute and storage on the same types of nodes, like that's not going to blow the system up.
Right.
And then and then you get into these trade-offs where it's like, yes, some individual box or an individual appliance might do something 10%, 20% better, 30% better. But where's the trade-off? Is it do you trade off performance for I now have to manage that with a completely different way of doing it, a different API, a different set of tools, or so storage always has that challenge in that it's you're going to make trade-offs somewhere. You hope that, like you said, your architects were thinking far enough ahead to say, hey, we're going to kind of make the architecture modular enough so that we don't blow it up when we have to add new stuff, but we don't really always know what new stuff we might have to add down the road. So it sounds like what you have in place has been thought through. It sounds like you're getting good feedback from customers that are saying like, we started here, but wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? And you're kind of realizing like, hey, we can do that. We don't have to blow the product up and start over. We don't have to, you sort of haven't gone, now we're in trouble. we can't take on that whole huge class of use cases.
There's 2 points to that, right? Like, so first of all, I think they really did do a pretty good job architecting like the base level, so it would be modular. That was like a design principle.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, customers don't have to come to Inktank to tell us that. They can actually become contributors to the code.
Yeah.
They can help make it better because Ceph is an open source project. So they can actually, help make it better. And I think that's kind of very interesting from a training perspective, is if we can go out and train customers and get them, bootstrapped and ready to go and do their things. And then we see them starting to contribute to that Ceph code and then become contributors and make improvements like we're talking about. You would never be able to do that in a commercial product. And that is just amazing to get that feedback immediately to the product because the product is open source and anybody can contribute. So It's very cool.
Right. Now, storage is kind of a complicated thing in terms of it's beyond the access protocols and so forth. I mean, there's backup, there's DR, there's a lot of sort of things that are beyond sort of primary storage. Like typically, where does Ceph sort of stop? Where do people in the community sort of say that shouldn't go into Ceph? It should be part of some other sort of project. Is it mostly sort of primary scale out storage, or are you seeing people try and do things around backup and DR and high availability and so forth?
So, I mean, I think we're seeing people use it in the traditional sense. In fact, one of the first service providers that was one of our first customers, their whole thing was that they were going to use it for VM backup and then archiving for their customers.
Okay.
And so you do absolutely see quite a bit of adoption where people are morphing that into the use case that they see. One thing that I think that we've also seen is people building. Today we don't present iSCSI, we don't present NFS, we don't present the traditional protocols, and a lot of that's just been because our focus has been, if you look at Ceph as a core, when you start to add those legacy protocols on, you start to break the whole model of everything can fail. Mm-hmm. But you've seen customers go ahead and build around that and say, okay, well, give us a reference architecture. Tell us how, if we want to use iSCSI or NFS, how we should do that. We can absolutely show them how they should be doing that so they can use it for those traditional use cases. The other thing that we're doing, too, is obviously working with, vendors like Citrix and VMware to make sure that, there's some way that their customers can adopt it. But it's still... If you look at being a startup, people may have heard me say this before, but sometimes it just doesn't make as much sense to go after a very crowded market. If you look at the storage startup market, it's incredibly crowded. If you're spending your time trying to convince people that you're trying to compete with EMC, to do that on the first swag, that's like you're not taking the low-hanging fruit. For us, taking the low-hanging fruit is saying, look, you can stand up an S3 and Swift compatible object store right on, in your own data center. You don't have to use AWS anymore. And people, the light bulb, or they say, hey, we're going to use the block side to build a back-end block store for this OpenStack stuff that we're trying out. Yep. So those are the low-hanging fruit for us. I think, on our roadmap, we'll start to get into more of the mainstream use cases, but we're definitely taking the low-hanging fruit that we're good at that other competitors aren't right off the bat. And it's proving to be pretty successful.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, listen, let me throw out one last thing to you guys, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. For either Inktank or for you guys as technologists, what's on your radar? We're nearing the 2013, assuming we actually all make it that far with the Mayans and everything. Like what's on your radar? What do you guys, what sort of, cool, what are you kind of keeping an eye on for next year?
I don't know if I'm keeping an eye on anything. I mean, for me, I've got my plate full.
Yeah.
Just getting up to speed on some of the open source technologies. I mean, if you sit in an enterprise for a while, you're so concentrated on what you're doing that, you might hear of things going on. So like for me, learning QEMU and KVM and I have a Cassandra shirt on. That has nothing to do with Inktank or Ceph, but I'm really interested in learning more about that. Just there's so much to learn about. I'm writing a vendor-neutral object storage e-learning module, and that's been interesting. Just trying to nail down. Okay, there's different properties that are common to everybody, but it's like every single company does the basic back end of it completely different.
Yeah.
So how do you teach that? So like for me, it's just kind of trying to catch up on some of the things that I haven't been up to date on, and trying to synthesize those and make sense of them.
No, that makes sense. I know Aaron, having shifted over to working on OpenStack, is saying a lot of the same things. It's just trying to figure out what all these projects mean, what do they do, how are they different, just nomenclature and terminology, and so okay, very, very cool. Ed, anything cool on your plate? You're always like to dig deep into the technology, or at least always used to.
Yeah. No, it's still the case. I think I'll echo the same thing that Aaron and Gina said around just it's a little bit new for me to be completely in the open source world. So what I've been spending quite a bit of time is just understanding the OpenStack ecosystem, understanding kind of the reality versus the perception out there. Be it there's a lot of people involved. Is there a lot of contribution, or is it is it maturing yet? So the most exciting thing I think that I can say is that we always talk about the commoditization up the stack of different components of it, and I think it's finally coming to fruition where you've got a lot of companies paying attention to things like OpenStack and CloudStack, where these are big undertakings. It's not a year ago or 2 years ago. I think that OpenStack was in a very interesting place where it was, my perception, and I think that's kind of proved out to be a little bit of the reality, is that they were spending a lot of time building up the hype around it, getting partners, but now actual contributions are coming into play, and you're seeing some real things come of it. So the most exciting thing for me is watching the commoditization is beginning to happen, and actually people are starting to do POCs and deploy it. Yeah. I'm still very cloud and storage focused. Right. The networking space has been a little interesting around SDN and those kinds of things. But again, I think those things are on the same kind of, maturity curve as you would see something like OpenStack.
Right. Now, I would agree. I think I saw an interesting chart. Now, it was a small poll, but I think they did a polling at Gartner Data Center, which kind of a very older school enterprisey sort of thing. But even in that, I think they had about 20% of the crowd said they were looking at OpenStack as being sort of their cloud management platform, and somewhere like 10, 12, 13% were saying we're looking at CloudStack. So when you consider 30, I think about 40% of them were looking at VMware. That's a pretty big number for something that a lot of people traditionally maybe don't even know where they would get the code from or who they would work with to do it. So that's encouraging.
It's encouraging and a little scary. I would love to talk to Aaron some more about the vocabulary thing, because I think that's been one of the most challenging things I've found, is that the development side calls things certain names that from the enterprise side we use the same word for something completely different. So I think there's a huge opportunity to be translators of some sort, or to have some kind of key to help people understand, if they're coming from the enterprise or if they're coming from the development side, trying to understand the enterprise side better.
Very cool. Well, we do have a decent number. We're finding more and more. We have a decent number of open source listeners. So if you are smart about this stuff, reach out to Gina. We'll put her contact information in the show notes, and and folks from the Zen community and folks from the Open Nebula community and a bunch of others, and obviously CloudStack and so forth. So, so real quick before we wrap this up, I want to give a real quick thank you to all the people that have made contributions to the charity project that Aaron and I are working on, the North Carolina Children's Hospital, that's part of the crazy Krispy Kreme donut run that we do every year. We're at about 35% of our $1,000 goal. Aaron and I are going to match that dollar for dollar, so we're at about 35% of the $2,000 goal. So want to thank everybody who's contributed to that. Your buddy Greg has been one of those contributors. There's a whole list of folks that we'll get posted and thank them publicly for. But folks, if you're lucky enough to have healthy kids and you're looking for some way to help out, or you could give a little bit, it'd be great, it'd be appreciated. The links are in the top right of the cloudcast.com or cloudcast.net website. So enough of that. For Ed and Gina, guys, thanks so much for being on the show. Where can folks find you? Where are you going to be out and about? Where can they find you on the web? Where can they find out more stuff about Ceph and Inktank?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Ed Sai on Twitter, though I haven't been tweeting lately because I've been on mysterious international trips these days. But Ed Sai on Twitter, and breathingdata.com is where I blog.
Cool.
And G Minks on Twitter, and my blog link is there. It's too long. I don't have a cool one like Ed. And we'll both be at Dell World next week too. So if anybody's in Austin, holler at us.
Very nice. All right, and we'll get all that in the show notes and everything else. So, guys, thanks for being on the show tonight. We're done for the evening. Folks, if you like the show, tell a friend, leave a review on iTunes. You can obviously find us at thecloudcast.net on Twitter and all the other social network things, and you can find the links off the webpage. So for Ed and Gina, and for Aaron, who's off doing other projects, thank you very much, and have a good night.